the old man at the corner of Maple and Fifth. The first thing Marcus Webb noticed about the old man was his shoes. They were good shoes, the kind with leather so dark and polished it caught the October light like a mirror. The kind that cost more than Marcus's mother made in a week. The old man was standing perfectly still at the corner of Maple Avenue and Fifth Street, right where the sidewalk cracked open in that long diagonal split that Marcus had been jumping over since he was 7 years old. And those shoes were planted on either side of the crack, like he couldn't decide which way to go. Marcus had seen confused old people before. There was Mr. Adeyemi from the 4th floor of their building, who sometimes forgot which apartment was his, and stood in the hallway looking at door numbers like they were written in a foreign language. There was the woman at the bus stop on Tuesdays who talked to someone who wasn't there. Chicago had a way of being very loud and very lonely at the same time, and sometimes that combination did something to people who had been in it too long. But this man was different, and Marcus couldn't immediately say why. He slowed his walk without meaning to. His backpack was heavy. Mrs. Kowalski had assigned 40 pages of reading that night on top of the math problem set, and he was already 20 minutes later than his mother expected him, which meant she would be standing in the kitchen with that particular expression she got when she was trying not to say, "Where were you?" but her eyebrows said it anyway. He had a reason to keep walking. He had several reasons. He kept walking. He made it 11 steps past the old man before he stopped. Something about the way the man's hands were hanging. Not tucked in pockets, not gripping a phone, not doing anything purposeful at all. Just suspended at his sides like he had forgotten what hands were for. Marcus had seen hands like that exactly once before, on his own father the night before he left, standing in the doorway of the apartment at 2 in the morning, while Marcus pretended to be asleep. Hands that had already made their decision but hadn't caught up to the rest of the body yet. He turned around. "Hey," Marcus said. He kept a few feet of distance. He wasn't stupid. "You okay?" The old man turned his head slowly, and his eyes took a moment to find Marcus's face, like a camera adjusting focus. Up close, Marcus could see that he was older than he'd first guessed. Not 70, but closer to 75, maybe, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now distinguished instead. All sharp lines and deep-set eyes the colour of old denim. His white hair was immaculate. His coat was cashmere, Marcus thought, though he only knew that word because his mother pointed at coats in store windows sometimes and said, "Cashmere," the way other people said, "someday." "I'm not certain," the old man said. His voice was steady, which surprised Marcus. People who were lost usually sounded it. "I was on my way somewhere, I believe. I can't quite." He paused. His hand came up and pressed briefly against his sternum, like he was checking that his heart was still in there. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be a bother." "You're not a bother," Marcus said, which was only half a lie. "Do you know your name?" The old man looked at him. Something moved in those denim blue eyes. Not confusion, Marcus thought, but something more careful than confusion. Something that was watching. "Edward," the old man said. "I believe it's Edward." "Okay, Edward." Marcus looked around. The street was empty in that particular way Chicago streets went empty in October, when the wind came off the lake and everyone who had somewhere to be went there quickly. There was a phone in his pocket. He could call 911. He could call his mother. He could, theoretically, go knock on the door of one of these houses and ask someone with more authority than a 12-year-old in a worn-out backpack to take responsibility for this situation. He looked at the old man's hands again, still hanging. "Do you know where you live?" Marcus asked. "I'm not sure," Edward said, and the words came out slowly, carefully, like he was reading from a script in a language he'd almost forgotten. "There are gaps. I apologize. This is embarrassing." "It's not embarrassing," Marcus said. "Come on, you can wait at my place while we figure it out." He didn't know why he said it. Later, when he thought about that moment, he would try to identify the exact calculation his brain had made in the split second between the thought and the words, and he couldn't find one. There was no calculation. There was just the old man's hands and the crack in the sidewalk between his shoes, and something in Marcus Webb's 12-year-old chest that simply could not keep walking. Their apartment was 6 blocks away, on the 3rd floor of a building that had been nice once, in the way that many things in that neighborhood had been nice once. The elevator had been broken for 4 months. The hallway on the 2nd floor smelled like the Nguyen's cooking, which was actually a good smell. But the hallway on the 3rd floor smelled like the argument the Petersons had been having in installments since August. Marcus noticed all of this the way he always noticed it, cataloguing it, filing it in the part of his brain reserved for things he couldn't change. He was aware of it more sharply now, with the old man walking beside him in his cashmere coat and his mirror shoes. He was aware of the chip in the 3rd step. He was aware of the buzzing fluorescent light on the 2nd floor landing. He was aware, in a way that sat somewhere between embarrassment and anger, that he was being aware of these things, that he was looking at his own home through someone else's eyes and finding it lacking. He was also aware that the old man had made it 6 blocks without any difficulty, navigating curbs and crosswalks without hesitation, and had not once stumbled or seemed genuinely uncertain of his feet. His mind wandered, his body did not. Marcus filed this away too. His mother was not in the kitchen when they arrived. She was at the table in the living room, still in her work clothes, the dark pants and the light blue polo shirt she wore to Hargrove Capital, where she cleaned 7 floors 3 days a week. With her shoes still on and her eyes closed, she startled awake when the door opened and went through the sequence Marcus knew by heart: confusion, recognition, relief, and then the next thing, which today was not exasperation, but something more complicated. "Marcus!" She stopped. She was looking at the old man. "Mum, this is Edward. I found him on Maple and 5th. Marcus hesitated. "He's having trouble remembering things." Diane Webb stood up. She was a tall woman, and when she stood up straight, she had a quality of presence that had nothing to do with how tired she was, which was usually very. She looked at the old man with the kind of careful attention she brought to problems that needed solving. "Sir," she said, "are you hurt?" No, Edward's voice was gentle. "Your son was very kind. I don't mean to impose on your evening." "You're not imposing," Diane said, in the same tone Marcus had used, and he felt a small, complicated pride at that. "Sit down. Marcus, get him some water." In the kitchen, filling a glass, Marcus heard his mother ask Edward quiet questions. Did he have a phone? Did he have a wallet? Was there a number she could call? And heard Edward answer them carefully, always with that same small delay, always with that same particular quality of someone reconstructing rather than remembering. He thought again about those 6 blocks, walked with no difficulty, no hesitation. He brought the water out and set it on the coffee table in front of Edward, and Edward looked up at him and said, "Thank you." And for one fraction of a second, something in his expression was entirely clear, entirely present, entirely seeing. And then it went soft again, like a window misting over, and he reached for the water slowly, like someone who wasn't sure of distances. Marcus sat in the chair across from him and watched and said nothing. His mother found the wallet in the inside breast pocket of the cashmere coat. Edward seemed to have forgotten it was there. Inside was a driver's license, several credit cards, and a business card so heavy and cream-coloured that it felt expensive just to hold it. Diane read the name on the card and went very still. "Edward Hargrove," she said, and her voice had changed in a way Marcus couldn't immediately name. She looked up. "Sir, are you Edward Hargrove, of Hargrove Capital?" The old man blinked at her. "I believe so, yes." Diane looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at Diane. He had heard the name Hargrove Capital thousands of times. It was printed on his mother's work shirts, on the badge she kept clipped to her lanyard, on the building he had eaten lunch in front of when she couldn't get a babysitter and had to bring him along. He had never connected it to a person the way it was connecting now. "I work for you," Diane said quietly. I clean the 12th floor. I've worked there for 3 years. Edward looked at her with those careful eyes. Do you? He said. You must be very good at your work. It was a strange thing to say, Marcus thought. Not, I'm sorry I don't recognize you, or what a coincidence. Just that. A statement of probability. They called 911. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes, Marcus counted. And they were professional and kind, and checked Edward's vitals and confirmed that he'd had a minor TIA 6 weeks prior and was on medication, and that his caregiver had apparently lost track of him that afternoon. There was paperwork, there were phone calls. At some point, a large black car appeared outside, and a man in a dark suit who was not smiling got out and spoke to the paramedics, and then came upstairs and spoke to Diane with the manner of someone who was paid to be thorough. Through all of it, Edward sat on their couch and held his water glass and looked around the apartment with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Not pity, something more like recognition. As if the apartment confirmed something he had already suspected. When they were loading him onto the gurney, carefully, he didn't actually need it, but the paramedics insisted, one of his hands moved oddly, and a small, flat object slipped from his coat pocket and fell onto the floor near Marcus's feet. It was a compass. Brass, old, the kind with a hinged lid, about the size of a large coin. The lid had initials engraved on it that Marcus couldn't make out from where he was standing. He picked it up. The man in the dark suit was already steering the gurney toward the hallway. Marcus looked at the compass and then at the door and then at the compass again. He put it in his pocket. I'll return it, he told himself. Next time I see him, I'll return it. He didn't examine too carefully the assumption that there would be a next time. Later, after his mother had heated up leftovers, and they had eaten in the particular silence that fell between them sometimes. Comfortable, no need to fill it, she said. You did a good thing today, baby. He would have been fine, Marcus said, because he was 12, and it was important to seem like you hadn't done anything particularly notable. Maybe, his mother said. She was looking at her plate. Maybe not. She paused, then said, more quietly, he kept looking at you, you know, while the paramedics were here. I don't think he was looking at me or them or anything else in this apartment. Just you. Marcus thought about the moment by the door, the window misting over. He's a weird guy, Marcus said. His mother said, in the tone that meant probably, but also, we'll see. That night, in his room, Marcus took the compass out of his pocket and set it on the desk under his lamp. The brass was warm from his pocket. He opened the lid. The needle swung once, twice, then settled, pointing with the calm certainty of something that had never been confused about where it was going, to true north. He looked at it for a long time. He thought about those 6 blocks, walked without a stumble. He thought about the careful delay in every answer, like someone performing rather than recalling. He thought about the moment of clarity at the coffee table, there and gone so fast he could have imagined it. He thought about a man who could call himself Edward and nothing else, and yet stand perfectly still at the corner of Maple and Fifth, as if he had chosen that exact corner, as if he had always known where he was going, as if the only thing he needed was for someone to walk him the rest of the way. He knew that corner, Marcus thought. He called it that, Maple and Fifth. How did he know the name of the corner if he didn't know where he was? He closed the compass lid, set it back under the lamp. He didn't sleep for a while. Before I go on, I want to ask you something. If you had figured it out that night, if you had known, before the paramedics came, that the old man's confusion was at least partly a performance, what would you have done? Would you have said something? Would you have called him out right there in the living room, in front of your mother, in front of the man in the dark suit? Or would you have looked at his hands, hanging at his sides, and understood that whatever he was performing, the loneliness underneath it, was entirely real? I'm not asking because I know the right answer. I'm asking because Marcus Webb sat in that chair and asked himself the same question. And the answer he came to that night, without fully knowing that he'd come to it, was the one that changed everything. If you're watching from somewhere Marcus has never been, if this story landed somewhere in your chest, let me know in the comments where you're joining us from. And if you want to know what happened at the corner of Maple and 5th, stay with me, we're just getting started. A standing invitation. The call came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the night of the compass. Marcus was eating cereal before school when his mother answered her phone and her face did the thing where it went careful and professional, which was different from the tired but present expression she kept for home, and different again from the worried expression she kept for bill-related correspondence. This was her work face, the one that came with a slightly straighter spine. "Yes," she said. "Yes, he is, of course." She held the phone out to Marcus with an expression he couldn't decode. "It's for you. It's Mr. Hargrove's office." The voice on the phone was a woman, brisk and efficient, with the kind of enunciation that suggested she had been trained in it. She explained that Mr. Hargrove had requested Marcus's presence for a visit. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock, at the offices of Hargrove Capital on the 41st floor. She explained that Mr. Hargrove remembered the kindness Marcus had shown him and wished to express his gratitude in person. She said the word gratitude the way people said it when they meant something more organized than a feeling. "He can come," Marcus said, before his mother could say anything. Then, because he had been raised with manners, "Tell him thank you for the invitation." When he hung up, his mother looked at him for a long moment. "Marcus," she said. "He's fine," Marcus said. "He just wants to say thank you." "He's your boss's 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 boss," his mother said. "And you're 12. "I know how old I am, Mum." She let him go because she trusted him, and because in some foundational way, Diane Webb had always understood that her son noticed things most people didn't notice, and that when he noticed something and moved toward it instead of away, there was usually a reason. The 41st floor of Hargrove Capital was nothing like the 12th. Marcus had seen the 12th floor, his mother's floor, twice, back when he was small enough that she'd had to bring him on school closure days. It was functional, fluorescent, arranged in the way of offices everywhere. Cubicles and printers, and the ambient hum of systems doing what they were built to do. It smelled like carpet cleaner and toner and the ghosts of 1,000 lunches. The 41st floor smelled like leather and old paper, and something faint underneath that Marcus couldn't identify for several seconds until he realized it was wood. Actual wood. The warm mineral smell of it, coming from the paneling on the walls and the furniture and the shelving that ran floor to ceiling along the south side of the office, filled not with binders or files, but with actual books. Edward Hargrove was standing at the window when Marcus was shown in. The city spread out below him. October now shading into November, the lake a flat grey plate to the east, the grid of streets below looking tiny and precise from this height. For a moment, Marcus just stopped and looked, because he had never seen Chicago from up here, and it turned out that Chicago from up here looked like something worth building. "You came," Edward said, without turning around. "You invited me," Marcus said. Now Edward turned. He was dressed differently from the night on the street corner, still formally but with the ease of someone in their own space. Jacket off, the sleeves of his white shirt rolled to the elbow. He looked sharper up here, more present. He studied Marcus with those denim blue eyes for a moment, and then something that might have been the beginning of a smile moved across the corner of his mouth. "How's your mother?" he asked. "She's good. She said thank you. She was nervous about me coming." "Smart woman," Edward said. "Sit down, please." Marcus sat in a chair that was probably worth more than everything in their apartment. He held his backpack on his lap because he wasn't sure where else to put it. "I'm told you kept my compass," Edward said, settling into the chair across from him, and there was no accusation in it, just information. "I was going to return it," Marcus said. I didn't have a way to get it to you. I have it here." He started to reach into his backpack. "Keep it," Edward said. The same words as before, the same tone, easy and final, like a door being closed gently rather than slammed. "It was my father's. I've had it for 50 years. He paused. I want it to go somewhere it'll be used. Marcus stopped, unzipping his backpack. You don't know me.
No, Edward agreed. I don't. Yet.
He looked at Marcus for a moment with that same quality of attention he'd had on the sidewalk. Careful, measuring, seeing more than the surface. I'd like to change that if you're willing. Come here on Saturdays, 10 o'clock. We'll talk. I'll pay you for your time. You don't have to pay me, Marcus said, and heard the sharpness in his own voice before he could soften it. He was good at being poor, in the way that kids who'd never been anything else got good at it. Quiet about it, managed, not a performance. But he was bad at being paid for things that weren't work. It felt like charity wearing a costume. Edward looked at him. All right, he said, without apology or explanation. Then come because you want to. Marcus looked at the window, at the city below, at the grey lake in the distance. What would we talk about? He asked. Whatever you want, Edward said. I'm told I need human contact. My doctors say isolation aggravates my condition. He said the word condition with a lightness that sat right on the edge of something, and Marcus caught it, the way you catch a sound in a room that you can't quite identify. And I find I'm running out of people who talk to me rather than around me. Marcus thought about this. Your son, he said. He'd looked up Hargrove Capital online after the phone call. He knew about Nolan Hargrove. Something in Edward's face shifted, not dramatically, not enough that you'd catch it if you weren't watching. A small interior weather change, cloud cover moving in. My son, Edward said, is a busy man. Okay, Marcus said. Okay? I'll come on Saturdays, but I'm not going to pretend I don't notice things. Edward looked at him for a long moment. Then that almost smile came back, fuller this time. Good, he said. That would make you the first. The Saturdays became a fact of Marcus's life, the way certain facts installed themselves gradually. Not all at once, but in the way that one Saturday became the next, until the idea of not going felt strange, like skipping a meal. He would take the bus downtown, ride the elevator to 41, be met by Edward's assistant, a compact and efficient woman named Rosario, who learned within the first 3 weeks that Marcus took his coffee with too much sugar and left a cup on the side table without being asked. They talked about everything and nothing, in the deliberate way that means you are actually talking about the important things while pretending not to. Edward asked about Marcus's school, not the diplomatic version, not how are your grades, but specific. What are you reading? What are you good at? What do you hate and why? Marcus told him about Mrs. Kowalski's English class, about the way he could do math quickly in his head, but the showing his work requirement felt like being asked to explain breathing. Edward told him about starting Hargrove Capital at 31, with a second mortgage on a house he didn't own yet, and a handshake deal with a man he'd met on a train. Was that smart? Marcus asked. Extraordinarily not, Edward said. It worked, though. Sometimes the two aren't as related as people think. Edward talked about real estate, the actual substance of it, not the money, but the buildings, the logic of how cities grow, where people need to be and why, what a neighborhood means. Marcus listened with the particular attention he reserved for things that were connecting to something he hadn't articulated yet, like pieces of a puzzle laid out before you could see the picture. He had always loved buildings. He had looked at them his whole life in that neighborhood. The way the old ones had detail the new ones didn't. The way the crack in the sidewalk followed the same diagonal as the shadow of the fire escape at 2 in the afternoon, and never had a word for what he was doing. Architecture, Edward said one Saturday after Marcus had spent 10 minutes describing what was wrong with the new development they could see from the window. That's what you're talking about. Have you ever thought about it? People like me don't do that, Marcus said, and heard how it sounded as soon as it was out. Edward was quiet for a moment. Who told you that? Nobody had to, Marcus said. Another silence, longer, then. Well, Edward said, I built a company that people like me weren't supposed to build either. My father was a factory worker. Your categories have more exceptions than you think. Marcus didn't answer, but he filed it away in the part of his brain that was slowly, without his full permission, getting bigger. It was in the 5th or 6th Saturday, early December, the first snow coming down in the way Chicago first snow always did, apologetically and then all at once, that Marcus showed up in his navy blue hoodie, the one with the small bleach stain on the left cuff that his mother hadn't been able to get out. And Edward, when Marcus sat down, said, "Cold enough for that? The navy one's not very heavy." He said it easily, conversationally, moving past it on the way to something else. But he'd said it. The navy one. Marcus had worn that hoodie last Saturday. Edward had noticed the colour. Edward had filed it. Marcus turned this over in his mind all morning while they talked about other things. Edward had reportedly been unable, 3 weeks after the incident, to reliably recall that he had a son. He could not, according to his doctors, retain short-term information consistently. He was on medication. He had a caregiver. His executive assistant managed his calendar because he could not be trusted to. But he had remembered a 12-year-old's navy blue hoodie. Marcus did not say anything. He was building a picture, piece by piece, and he was not ready yet to say what the picture was. He was not sure what saying it would accomplish, or what it would cost, or whether the cost was his to calculate. He did know this. Whatever the old man was doing, and whatever his reasons were, the loneliness inside it was not performed. You could not perform loneliness at that particular frequency. Marcus had been around too many people who were truly alone to be fooled by imitation. So what did it mean, he wondered, to know that a man was pretending and to also know that the thing underneath the pretense was real? He didn't have an answer yet. The first time he met Nolan Hargrove was a Saturday in mid-December, and it was not a planned meeting. Nolan appeared in the doorway of the office at 11:30, a tall man in his late 40s who had his father's bone structure and none of his stillness, carrying himself with the forward lean of someone always arriving somewhere they should have been 10 minutes ago. He stopped when he saw Marcus. "Who's this?" he said. "A friend," Edward said pleasantly. Nolan looked at his father, then at Marcus, then at his father again. Something happened in his face that he controlled quickly, but not quickly enough. Marcus had a gift for reading adult faces. You developed it when you were a kid who needed to know in advance what kind of evening was coming. And what he read in Nolan Hargrove's face in that moment was something between surprise and a calculation being made. "We need to talk about the Riverside project," Nolan said to Edward. "Of course," Edward said. Marcus was just leaving. He looked at Marcus. "Same time next week?" "Same time next week," Marcus said. He picked up his backpack. He said polite things to Nolan, who said polite things back. And the politeness was so thorough on both sides that it was almost like a conversation. On the elevator ride down, Marcus thought about Nolan's face, the calculation in it. He thought, that man is not worried about his father's health. He thought, he is worried about something else. He did not yet know enough to name what it was. But he was 12 years old, and he was paying attention, and he added Nolan Hargrove to the picture he was building, and the picture got darker in one corner. The last Saturday before Christmas, Edward handed him something as he was leaving, a small package wrapped in actual paper with a card. "It's not charity," Edward said immediately before Marcus could say anything. "It's a book. Books are what people give each other when they want to say something they don't know how to say directly." Marcus opened it in the elevator. It was a book on the history of Chicago architecture, thick, heavy, full of photographs. Inside the front cover, in handwriting that was deliberate and slightly unsteady, Edward had written, "For Marcus, who already sees. The rest is just vocabulary." E.H. Marcus looked at it for the entire bus ride home. He didn't read it yet. He just held it. When he got home, his mother was in the kitchen, and he showed her the book, and she looked at the inscription and something moved through her expression. Not quite tears, something more complicated. The face of a woman who had been trying very hard for a long time to give her son a different story than the one the neighborhood usually wrote. "He's a good man," Marcus said, and realized as he said it that he meant it without reservation, without the small hedge he kept for most things. His mother looked at him. "What are you not telling me?" she said. Marcus considered. "Nothing," he said. "Not yet." She let it go. She trusted him. That night he put the book on his desk next to the compass. Under the lamp, the brass needle pointed north. It always pointed north. Whatever else was uncertain about Edward Hargrove, the gaps, the carefully timed pauses, the performance in those first careful hours, the compass had never lied about where it was going. What sons are made of. 2 years passed. That sentence sounds too simple for what it contained. Let me try again. 2 years pass the way they do when you are 14, and something in your life has quietly rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Not all at once, not in any moment you can point to and say, there, but in the gradual accumulation of Saturday mornings and December books, and conversations that started as pleasantries and ended somewhere neither of you had planned to go. Marcus Webb grew 4 inches, switched from cereal to eggs, developed opinions about brutalist architecture that would have surprised his 5th grade teacher, and stopped being afraid of elevators that went above the 30th floor. He also stopped, sometime in the spring of the 2nd year, making any effort to hide the fact that he was sharp, the particular self-protective dimming that kids in his position often learned. The way you didn't answer too fast in class, because being the poor kid, who was also the smart kid, was a targeting system. And he wasn't sure exactly when it had happened, but he thought it had something to do with the way Edward Hargrove listened to him. Edward did not talk down. Edward did not explain things Marcus hadn't asked about. Edward treated a conversation with Marcus the same way he apparently treated conversations with the contractors and city planners and legal strategists who came through that office, as an exchange between people who both had information worth having. It was the most straightforwardly respectful thing anyone had ever done for Marcus, and it had the effect of rearranging something in him at a structural level, Diane noticed. She didn't say much about it, in the way she didn't say much about things she was watching carefully. But she noticed. The thing Marcus noticed in the 2nd year was how the edges of Edward's condition kept blurring in ways that followed no medical logic he could find when he looked it up. He had, by now, read quite a lot about TIAs and the cognitive effects of minor strokes. He had read about memory inconsistency and executive function and the difference between encoding failure and retrieval failure. He had done this carefully, in the school library during lunch, not telling anyone why, building a framework so he could hold what he observed against something solid. What he observed was this. Edward Hargrove forgot easily and plausibly in the presence of doctors, caregivers, and his son. He forgot names, dates, the contents of recent conversations. He asked the same questions twice. He misplaced things. In the presence of Marcus, alone in the office on Saturday mornings, he forgot very little. Not nothing. There were moments, genuine ones, when something snagged or slipped, when Edward reached for a word and didn't find it immediately, when a name took a moment too long. Marcus knew the real versions of these moments because they had a different texture from the performed ones, a different quality of frustration underneath them, something more private and more bleak. The real ones Edward moved past quickly, without comment, the way you move past something that makes you ashamed. The performed ones he held for half a beat longer. Just enough. Marcus thought about this for a long time before he arrived at what he thought was true, which was this. Edward Hargrove had had a genuine medical event 2 years ago. It had scared him, probably more than he'd told anyone, and somewhere in the aftermath, in the gap between what he actually lost and what other people assumed he'd lost, he had found something useful. A way to watch, a way to test, a way to be invisible in his own life and see what people did when they thought he couldn't track it. The question was why. Marcus thought he knew. He just didn't have enough pieces yet to be sure. The answer came partly from Rosario, Edward's assistant, on a Thursday afternoon in October, when Marcus stopped by the office to drop off a book he'd borrowed and found her alone, working late, willing to talk to a 14-year-old in a way that suggested she'd been carrying something and needed somewhere to put it. She talked about the night of Edward's first TIA, not the one Marcus already knew about, but an earlier one, 18 months before Marcus had ever met Edward on the street corner. The one that had sent Edward to Northwestern Memorial for 4 days. Mr. Nolan had power of attorney drawn up by the second night, Rosario said, without inflection, straightening a stack of papers that was already straight. Standard precaution, the lawyer said, in case Mr. Hargrove needed medical decisions made. She paused. He also had preliminary conversations with an asset management firm about the portfolio. The second night, Marcus said. His father was still in the ICU, Rosario said. They didn't know yet if there would be lasting damage. She said it without editorial. She didn't need to. Marcus went home that evening and sat for a while with the compass in his hand, thinking about a man lying in a hospital bed while his son's lawyers drafted documents. Thinking about what that would do to a person, what it would close off in them, what it would teach them to expect. He thought, this is why he tests. He thought, he doesn't test because he's cruel or suspicious. He tests because the last time he stopped testing, someone took a chair in his life while he was still in it. And then, underneath that, a thought he didn't fully welcome. He's been testing me too, for 2 years, and I've let him. He set the compass down. He thought about whether that bothered him. He decided, after a while, that it didn't. Not because he was endlessly patient or saintly. He wasn't. He had a temper. He held grudges about small things for longer than was reasonable. He had a long list of subjects on which he was wrong and knew it and didn't care. But because he understood, in the particular way you understand things that you've lived adjacent to all your life, what it meant to have learned that people leave. His father had left. Friends had left. Teachers who'd seemed interested had moved on. You could build a very sound structural case for the position that the correct response to human beings was a controlled distance, and Edward Hargrove had more evidence for that position than most. So Marcus let the test run. He let it run because the thing being tested, his basic willingness to show up again without an agenda, was something he was actually confident in, and because making a man like Edward Hargrove feel caught and ashamed would accomplish nothing except making them both unhappy. But he kept the compass. And he waited. The first time Nolan tried to shut him out, it was a Tuesday in November. Marcus had come by the building, not a Saturday, just a Tuesday after school, because Edward had called and asked if he might come by. There was something he wanted to show him. A set of architectural drawings for a project Edward had consulted on in the 1980s that had resurfaced from a storage unit. It was an irregular request. Marcus had come. He got to the lobby, and the front desk security guard, not the usual one, someone new, told him that he wasn't on the visitor list and that unscheduled guests needed prior clearance. "I have clearance," Marcus said. "I come every Saturday. Ask Rosario." "I can't reach Ms. Rosario," the guard said, in the tone of someone following a script they'd been given that morning. "Can you try Mr. Hargrove directly?" "I'm not authorized to." "Okay," Marcus said. He sat down in one of the lobby chairs. He put his backpack on the floor in front of him. He took out his history homework. He waited. He waited for 1 hour and 40 minutes. He finished the history homework and started the English essay. People came and went. The security guard checked on him twice, both times with decreasing confidence, as if Marcus's unmoving presence was creating a structural problem in his instructions. At 6:15, the elevator doors opened and Edward Hargrove walked out. He walked, not shuffled, not moved with the careful-footed hesitance of his public presentation. Walked, upright, covering the distance from the elevator bank to the lobby desk in a straight line, with the purposeful economy of a man who had been walking through buildings he owned for 40 years. He saw Marcus. He stopped. "The drawings are still upstairs," he said. "Come up." "Your guard has me on some kind of restricted list," Marcus said, standing, slinging his backpack on. "He's being corrected," Edward said. His voice was entirely even, but his jaw was set in a way Marcus had learned to read as, controlled anger being held at a distance. This won't happen again. In the elevator, neither of them spoke. Edward looked straight ahead at the brushed steel doors. Marcus looked at his reflection in the steel, distorted and dim, and thought about what it cost a 73-year-old man to walk down 41 floors in his own building to collect a 14-year-old from a lobby guard who had been told to keep him out. He thought about whose instruction that guard had been given. He didn't ask. Edward didn't offer. The elevator reached 41, and they walked out into the warm, leather and wood smell of the office. And Rosario appeared from around a corner with an expression that said she had been handling something difficult for the past hour and a half. And the three of them settled back into the ordinary business of looking at 1980s architectural drawings while Chicago went dark outside the window. 3 weeks later, a Thursday evening, Marcus's phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, and he almost didn't answer it. It was Edward. "I'm sorry to call on a school night," Edward said. "I won't keep you long." A pause, the kind that had weight in it. "I wanted to tell you that I've been in conversations with my attorney about some arrangements I want to put in order. I'm not unwell. I mean, no worse than usual." A short, wry sound that was almost a laugh. "But a man my age should have things in order, and I've been putting it off." "Okay," Marcus said. "I mention it because the conversations have been involved, and because Nolan is aware that I'm meeting with the attorney and he's not pleased." "Are you safe?" Marcus said, and the directness of it surprised even himself. A silence. Then, "Yes, nothing so dramatic. He's angry, and he'll be loud about it, and it will pass. He's my son. He's not—" Another pause, longer. "He's afraid. That's what anger usually is, I find, when it comes from someone who loves you inadequately." Marcus thought about his father, standing in the doorway at 2 a.m, hands hanging. "I know," he said. "I thought you might," Edward said. Another pause, then, quietly, almost as if he hadn't quite meant for it to come out. "She raised a good boy, that Diane. Better than I managed." Marcus didn't say anything. He held the phone and listened to the ambient quiet on Edward's end. The faint sound of a building settling, the almost inaudible presence of a city 41 floors below. "Same time Saturday?" Marcus said. "Same time Saturday," Edward said. The last Saturday of November, Marcus arrived at 10 o'clock and found the office quieter than usual. Rosario wasn't at her desk. The big room was lit only by the desk lamp and the grey November light from the window. Edward was at his desk and he was writing. Not typing, but writing by hand, his head bent, moving through pages with the focused intentionality of a man who had things he needed to say and not much time for saying them. He looked up when Marcus came in. He closed the folder he was writing in. He moved it to the side. "Sit down," he said. They talked for 3 hours that day. They talked about more than they usually did, in the way people talk when something is ending and nobody has said so. Edward talked about his wife, Eleanor. Marcus had never heard him mention her by name before, and how she had died of pancreatic cancer 8 years ago, in 72 days from diagnosis to death, and how the speed of it had felt like a betrayal because it left no time for the conversations you always assume you'll eventually have. He talked about what he would do differently. He did not look self-pitying when he said this. He looked like someone filing an accurate report. Marcus told him about the essay he'd written, the one about cities, about how the design of a neighborhood either opens possibility or closes it, about how architecture is a political act, whether architects admit it or not. He'd gotten an A. He'd also gotten a comment in the margins from Mr. DeLuca. "This is college-level thinking. Have you looked at summer programs?" "Show me the essay," Edward said. Marcus showed him. Edward read it without speaking, all the way through. Then he set it down and looked at Marcus for a moment. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what are your plans or what's your goal, just what do you want?" "I want to build things," Marcus said. "Good things. The kind that opened possibility instead of closing it. Then do that, Edward said simply. He said it in the same tone he'd used 2 years ago. Easy and final. Like a door being closed gently. Like something being decided. Marcus picked up the compass from where he'd left it on Edward's desk. He'd taken to setting it there during Saturdays, a habit neither of them had commented on, and held it for a moment. The needle swung and settled. I should tell you something, Marcus said. Edward looked at him. About that first night, the corner of Maple and Fifth. Marcus turned the compass over in his hand. You said the name of the corner. You said Maple and Fifth when you were explaining to the paramedics where I found you. But when I was walking you to my place, you didn't know where you were. He looked up. How did you know the name of the corner? The room was very quiet. Edward's face did something complicated and brief, and then settled into something like stillness. I know, Marcus said quietly, not unkindly. I've known for a while. I just thought you should know that I know. He set the compass back on the desk. I'm not telling you to call it off or explain yourself or anything like that. I just wanted you to know you don't have to pretend with me. Another silence, longer than the rest. Then Edward said, How long? The second Saturday, maybe, when you remembered the navy hoodie. Edward looked at the compass on his desk. Then he looked at Marcus. And you didn't say anything, he said. It wasn't a question. You needed it to be what it was, Marcus said. He shrugged, a 14-year-old's shrug, but his eyes were steady. So I let it be what it was. Edward was quiet for a long time. Outside, the November light shifted through the clouds and came through the window and lay across the floor between them. I owe you an apology, Edward said. You don't, Marcus said. You owe me the truth, maybe, but not an apology. Edward looked at him for another long moment, and then, for the first time in 2 years of Saturday mornings, he laughed. A real one, surprised out of him, brief and low. The laugh of a man who hadn't seen something coming and was genuinely glad of it. All right, he said. The truth then, starting next Saturday. The thing he knew all along. Edward Hargrove died on a Thursday morning in January. He died, according to the medical examiner, in his sleep, which meant he died in the way that living things rarely got to choose and often deserved, without announcement or extended suffering, in the grey and early hours before a city woke. The night nurse who checked on him at 6 found him in the same position as midnight, which was lying on his right side with one hand flat under his cheek, the way, she told the paramedics, unprompted, because she had noticed it. He always slept. He had, she said, looked peaceful. He had looked like someone who had finished something. Marcus learned about it from his mother, who learned about it from a news alert, who learned it on Friday morning at breakfast. She read the alert on her phone, looked up and looked at her son, and her expression said everything before her words did. Marcus sat with the information for a moment. He had known, in the abstract way you know things about elderly men in their mid-70s who have had 2 strokes, that it was coming. Abstract knowledge does not prepare you. It is only meant to. He sat at the kitchen table for a minute, very still, and then he said, I have to go to school. Marcus, his mother said. I'm okay, he said. I want to go. He went. He got through the day the way you get through days that happen inside a piece of glass. You can see everything, participate in everything, but there's a surface between you and the temperature of it. He came home. He sat in his room. He didn't look at the compass on his desk, and then he looked at it. He picked it up and held it, and let himself think about the last Saturday, 3 weeks ago, January 6th, when they had sat in the office and Edward had talked, finally, without the frame of any performance at all. Just an old man talking to a teenager he trusted, which was, Marcus understood now, the most vulnerable thing Edward Hargrove had done in possibly a decade. He had told Marcus about Eleanor. The real version, longer than what he'd shared before. He had told him about Nolan. Not bitterly, the way Marcus had been expecting, but with the exhausted complexity of a parent who loved their child and could not help clearly seeing them. He had said, he was different before his mother died. He was a different kind of person. I don't know if that's an excuse or just a fact. He had said, I've let too many things go too long without saying. He had said, at the very end, when Marcus was putting on his coat, whatever happens from here, I want you to know that these 2 years have been... And then he had stopped and shaken his head slightly, and Marcus had waited, and Edward had said only, they've mattered. That's what I wanted to say. Marcus had said, I know, sir. They've mattered to me too. He sat in his room now and held the compass and the needle pointed north, and he cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the private and functional way of someone who has learned that grief is a task that requires completion, not avoidance. Then he washed his face. Then he sat down and opened his school books. Then, 4 days later, Rosario called and said, there is a reading of the will on Friday, and Marcus's presence has been requested. The conference room on the 41st floor of Hargrove Capital held 12 people on that Friday afternoon, and Marcus Webb was the youngest by roughly 35 years. He arrived with his mother, who had taken the afternoon off. Her manager, who had learned who Marcus was only in the last month, had not protested, and they sat together at the far end of the long table. Marcus was wearing the best thing he owned, which was the dark button-down shirt his mother had given him for his birthday, and he had his backpack on the floor at his feet because he didn't own a briefcase, and the backpack was what he had. Nolan Hargrove sat at the other end of the table. He had brought 2 men Marcus didn't know, both in suits, both with the manner of lawyers, which was to say, the manner of people who were paid to look like they were the calmest person in any room. Nolan himself was not calm. He had the controlled surface of a man who had decided in advance what he expected to feel and was holding to it with both hands. He had looked at Marcus when Marcus came in. He had not said hello. The attorney's name was Gerald Forthright, and he had worked for Edward Hargrove for 22 years, and he began the reading with the brisk efficiency of a man who knew the room contained combustible material and intended to move through it before anything ignited. The standard provisions went quickly. Charitable endowments to 3 organizations, business interests handled through a prearranged structure that was legally airtight and which Nolan's lawyers had seen before and were already familiar with. Nolan's inheritance was there, significant, structured, the product of a pre-existing shareholder agreement rather than the will itself, which insulated it from contest and which Forthright noted carefully. Then Forthright looked up from the document. Additionally, he said, Mr. Hargrove established a separate trust instrument dated November 30th of last year and witnessed by 2 independent attorneys and a notary, creating the Eleanor Webb Education Trust. Nolan moved, not dramatically, a small motion, a straightening, the physical equivalent of an alert signal, in the amount of $4,200,000, designated for the educational and professional development expenses of Marcus James Webb, age 14, of Chicago, Illinois, administered by a 3-person trustee board until Mr. Webb's 18th birthday, and thereafter by Mr. Webb himself, with no conditions other than, "Stop," Nolan said. Forthright looked up. "Stop," Nolan said again. He was looking at Marcus now, not at the attorney. "What is this?" "The trust instrument," Forthright said calmly. "I've just described it." "My father," Nolan said, and his voice was controlled in the way that things are controlled just before they stop being controlled, was not of sound mind when he signed anything in the last 6 months. He had documented cognitive impairment following 2 vascular events. Any instrument he signed. Mr. Hargrove's capacity at the time of signing has been evaluated by... He forgot his own name on a public street 2 years ago, Nolan said. The room went very still. There are medical records. There are witnesses. A man who cannot remember where he lives cannot be held to have possessed the legal capacity to... Nolan, Forthright said, with a patience that suggested this conversation had been anticipated. The capacity evaluation was conducted by a neuropsychologist retained independently, whose assessment will be submitted as evidence. Additionally, Mr. Hargrove left a supplementary document that addresses your concern directly. He reached into a folder. I was instructed to read it aloud in the event the trust was challenged. Nolan went very still. Forthright unfolded a single handwritten page. He cleared his throat. He read, "If you are hearing this, then someone has questioned my mind. I wrote these pages in my own hand because a man's handwriting is harder to argue with than his decisions. I will be brief. I was not confused when I signed. I have not been confused about the things that matter for quite some time. There is a boy named Marcus Webb who figured out, in the second week of our acquaintance, before I had given him any reason to trust me, that I was running a test. He figured it out because he is perceptive, and he said nothing about it for 2 years because he is kind. And he told me eventually because he believed I deserved the truth. These are the qualities I have spent 40 years looking for in business partners, attorneys, and family members. I found them in a 12-year-old boy who walked a stranger home in October. The trust is called the Eleanor Webb Trust because my late wife would have liked him enormously, and because his mother, Diane Webb, has cleaned the floors of my building for 3 years without my ever once thinking to ask her name. Consider this a correction. The room was quiet. Marcus was looking at the table. He had known, intellectually, that Edward had liked him. He had not, if he was honest, let himself know the full extent of what those 2 years had been on Edward's side of them. The words moved through him in a way that was too large for the room, too large for a conference table, too large for a Friday afternoon in January. He felt his mother's hand close over his under the table. He did not look up. Nolan Hargrove stood. He said, "This is fraudulent. The incapacity is documented. The boy had access to him, a child off the street, with a mother who worked for him with obvious motive." "Nolan," Forthright said. "I'm contesting this," Nolan said. "Every instrument, every document, on grounds of incapacity and undue influence." He looked at Marcus with an expression that had abandoned pretense. It was not pure cruelty, Marcus thought, even now. It was fear, refined over years into something that looked like contempt. "You don't belong here." Marcus looked at him. He said evenly, "I know." Then he said, "But he wanted me here. And I think what you actually mean is that you don't want me here. And those are different things." The silence afterward lasted 4 seconds. Marcus counted. The legal challenge was filed the following week. It went where Forthright had told Marcus it would go, given the medical records that formed its basis. To a motion hearing in probate court, where the question of Edward Hargrove's mental capacity at the time of signing would be formally argued. And it was at this point that Marcus Webb understood for the first time what it would actually cost him to protect what Edward had left. Forthright explained it carefully. The challenge rested on documented evidence of cognitive impairment. The hospital records from both TIA events, the evaluations, the records of the caregiver who had tracked his lapses. To rebut this effectively, the best evidence available was the direct testimony of someone who had spent significant, regular, documented time with Edward Hargrove and could speak to his actual cognitive state. That person was Marcus, and the specific thing Marcus would need to testify to was this: that Edward's behavior around the supposed memory loss was, at least in part, deliberate. That he had performed aspects of his impairment. That the incidents documented by others, including the October incident on Maple and 5th, had an element of staging to them, which meant Marcus would need to stand up in a legal proceeding and say, "I knew he was pretending. I've known for almost 2 years, and I said nothing." "They'll use that," Forthright said. "Nolan's attorneys will use it to argue that Marcus had knowledge of deception and chose not to disclose it, which implies either complicity or manipulation." "He wasn't manipulating anyone," Diane said, very quietly, from across the table. "I know that," Forthright said. The question is whether we can demonstrate it. Marcus was quiet for a long time. He was holding the compass under the table, which he had taken to carrying everywhere since the reading of the will. The metal was warm. He thought about the court. He thought about standing up in a room full of adults and saying the true things out loud. The things he had figured out and held and chosen not to say. The specific, considered choice of a 14-year-old who had understood something about grief and loneliness that most adults still argued about. He thought about what Edward had written. He said nothing because he is kind, and he told me eventually because he believed I deserved the truth. He was being asked to do the same thing again. The truth, even when it cost something. He looked at Forthright. I'll testify, he said. He felt his mother's hand on his arm. He didn't move away from it. I'll testify, he said again. I'll tell them exactly what I knew and when I knew it and why I didn't say anything. All of it. He looked at the brass compass in his lap. He said he chose me because I could be trusted with the truth. So, this is me being trusted with it. Forthright nodded slowly. Diane said nothing. She didn't need to. Outside the windows of Forthright's office, January Chicago was doing what it always did, which was being cold and grey and indifferent and magnificent. Marcus looked at it for a moment. The grid of streets, the flat lake in the distance, the buildings catching the winter light. He thought about the first time he'd seen that view from 41 floors up, at 10 years old in the conference room on Edward's opposite side, and how the city had looked like something worth building. He still thought so. True north. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and forced air, and the particular kind of seriousness that accumulates in rooms where people spend years arguing about what is true. Marcus Webb sat in a wooden chair behind a railing on the right side of the room and waited. He was 14 years old, but he had been told by Gerald Forthright to sit straight and speak clearly and answer only what was asked and not more. And he was doing all three. His backpack was at his feet. His mother was in the gallery behind him, 2 rows back, and he had looked at her once when he came in, and she had given him the expression she kept for things that were going to be hard, but not impossible. Which was not a smile exactly, but was adjacent to one. Nolan Hargrove was across the room with his 2 lawyers, and he was wearing a suit that cost more than the compass was worth to anyone except Marcus. And he was not looking at Marcus. The attorney Nolan had brought, a woman named Sheridan, whom Forthright had described as aggressive and good, in that order, stood up and began. She was, Marcus thought, excellent. She established the medical history efficiently, the first TIA, the second TIA, the documented observations of the caregiver, the nursing staff, the attending physicians, the tests that showed measurable deficits in short-term retention and executive planning. She established the chronology. Marcus had met Edward less than a month after the first documented incident. She established the opportunity. Regular, private, unsupervised access. She was building a container for a narrative, and the narrative was a vulnerable old man and a boy with proximity and motive. She did it without being personally unkind to Marcus. That was smart. You didn't go after a 14-year-old in a courtroom, not openly. You just built the container and let the logic fill it. When Forthright stood up to question Marcus, he did so with the same efficiency. Marcus, he said, can you tell the court how you met Edward Hargrove? Marcus told it. He kept it flat and factual the way Forthright had coached him. The street corner, the walk home, his mother's apartment, the paramedics. He did not editorialize. He did not perform. He told it the way it happened. And at any point during that initial encounter, Forthright said, did you have any reason to doubt that Mr. Hargrove was genuinely confused about his whereabouts? Yes, Marcus said. The room shifted slightly, a subtle change in attention. Can you describe what gave you that impression? He named the corner, Marcus said. He said Maple and Fifth when he was explaining to the paramedics where I had found him. But when I was walking him to my house, he didn't know where he was. He paused. If you don't know where you are, You don't know the name of where you are. That's not how it works. Did you say anything about this observation at the time? No. Why not? Marcus thought about how to say it accurately. He had practiced this, not the words, but the thinking underneath them, so that when the moment came, it would come from the right place. Because it didn't change what he needed, Marcus said. He was on a street corner, alone at night. He was cold. He paused. He was lonely. That part wasn't pretend. Whatever the memory stuff was, the other part was real. And telling him I'd figured it out wouldn't have helped him. He looked at the compass in his hands. He'd asked Forthright if he could hold it during testimony, and Forthright had said yes, because it was relevant evidence, and also because he had good instincts about what a room needed. So I walked him home. And in the subsequent 2 years, Forthright said, what was your assessment of Mr. Hargrove's mental capacity? Sharp, Marcus said. Not perfect. There were real moments, things he actually struggled with, and those were different from the other kind. The real ones embarrassed him. He moved past them fast. The other kind he'd hold for a beat too long. The other kind. The performance, Marcus said. It was the first time he'd used the word out loud. It sat in the room differently than he expected, not harsh, just accurate. Forthright nodded. And you discussed this with Mr. Hargrove before his death? Yes, the last Saturday in November. I told him I knew. I told him I'd known for a while. What was his response? Marcus looked at the compass. The needle was pointing toward the windows. You laughed, Marcus said. He said, all right. The truth then, starting next Saturday. A pause. Forthright let it rest there. Then Sheridan stood for cross-examination, and the tone in the room changed the way temperature changes in a room when a window opens. She was not unkind, but she was thorough in the way that thorough can feel like something else. Marcus, she said. And she said his name easily, familiarly, which was a choice. You've just testified that Mr. Hargrove was, in your words, performing aspects of his cognitive impairment. Yes. And you observed this and said nothing, not to your mother, not to his medical staff, not to his caregiver. That's right. For almost 2 years. Yes. Can you help us understand why a 14-year-old boy would observe what he believed to be medical fraud and stay silent for 2 years? It wasn't medical fraud, Marcus said. He said it evenly, without heat. He wasn't taking medication he didn't need. He wasn't deceiving his doctors about symptoms that needed treatment. He was managing what other people assumed about him. That's different. Is it? Sheridan said. He allowed medical professionals to document impairments. That were real, Marcus said. The underlying condition was real. The impairments happened. He let other people think they were more total than they were. He paused. You've never done something like that? Let someone think you were less capable than you were because you needed to see what they'd do. A murmur moved through the gallery. The judge didn't intervene, but her expression shifted slightly. Sheridan moved on. The trust bears the name Eleanor Webb. Your mother's name is Diane Webb. Did you know Edward Hargrove's late wife was named Eleanor? No, Marcus said. Not until the reading. You were surprised? Yes. You have no theory as to why Mr. Hargrove would name a trust after your mother. It's not named after my mother, Marcus said. Her name is Diane. Eleanor was his wife. Forthright read the letter. Yes, Sheridan said, unfazed. The letter, a handwritten letter, produced after death that cannot be cross-examined. She paused. You have a significant financial interest in the validation of that letter. Yes, Marcus said. $4 million. 4.2. $4.2 million. You're 14 years old. That's your answer when I ask if you have an interest in this proceeding. You're asking me to acknowledge it, Marcus said. I'm acknowledging it. Yes, it's a lot of money. That doesn't change what I know or what I saw. Those are separate things. He looked at her steadily. I'd be happy to answer questions about what I saw. Sheridan studied him for a moment. She had the expression of someone who had cross-examined a lot of witnesses and was recalibrating. "What did you see?" she said, and the question was slightly different now, less structured, more genuine. "A man," Marcus said, "who'd been betrayed by the person who was supposed to love him most, who'd been watching people for his whole life to figure out who he could trust, who'd stopped believing that anyone would choose to just be there for him without wanting something back." He looked down at the compass. "I saw him be right about that, mostly. And then I watched him decide to be wrong about it for a while, about me. And I saw what that cost him, that decision, and I wasn't going to make it harder." The gallery was quiet. Sheridan said, after a moment, "No further questions." Forthright had told Marcus they would know within 2 weeks. The motion would be heard, the evidence would be weighed, and the judge would rule on whether the challenge could proceed to full trial. It did not take 2 weeks, it took 9 days. The ruling was delivered in writing, and Forthright called Marcus at home to read it to him. The judge had found that the independent neuropsychological evaluation, combined with Marcus's testimony and the supplementary handwritten document, constituted sufficient evidence of Mr. Hargrove's capacity at the time of signing. The challenge did not have grounds to proceed to trial. The trust stood. "What about Nolan?" Marcus asked. "He has 30 days to file further appeal," Forthright said. "I believe his attorneys will advise him against it. The new evidence on the record makes another attempt costly and unlikely to succeed." A pause. Marcus looked out the window of his room. "Forthright," he said. "In the letter, he said his wife would have liked me." "Yes," Forthright said. "Did she, do you know anything about her, Eleanor?" A pause that was gentle in the way of pauses from old men who have been holding stories for years. "She was," Forthright said, "the kind of woman who could sit with a person for 10 minutes and make them feel that their concerns were the only concerns in the world. She listened." Another pause. "She would have liked you. That part is accurate." Marcus said thank you. He said goodbye. He hung up the phone. He sat in his room for a while. Then he went to the kitchen where his mother was cooking dinner, and he stood in the doorway for a moment watching her. The way she moved, economical and practiced, the sound she made without noticing, the way the kitchen light was warm on the side of her face. She had cleaned 7 floors of a building for 3 years and never been thanked for it by the man who owned it. She had raised her son alone in a 3rd-floor apartment with a broken elevator, and she had done it without flinching. She had sat 2 rows behind him in a courtroom while he testified, and she had not once told him not to. "Mum," he said. She turned. He crossed the kitchen and he hugged her, which was not something he did habitually. He was 14 and there were forms. And she wrapped her arms around him without saying anything or asking questions, which was exactly what he needed. And they stood there in the warm kitchen for a minute, and neither of them said a word about any of it. He had needed air. The building's steps were wide and grey and cold in the March air, and Marcus sat on them with his backpack between his feet, and his coat zipped to the throat, and the brass compass open in his palm. His mother had gone to get the car from the parking structure 2 blocks away. He had told her he'd wait outside. She had looked at him and nodded and gone. The city moved past him the way it always did. Indifferent, enormous, beautiful in the specific way that requires you to accept its indifference before you can see the beauty. Taxis and buses and people in coats with somewhere to be, and pigeons on the ledge above him doing the thing pigeons did, and the pale March sky with its particular Chicago quality, wide and grey and not quite ready yet to promise spring. Marcus looked at the compass. You thought about the first Saturday, sitting in that leather chair across from an old man who had spent 2 years figuring out whether anyone could be trusted. He thought about the 6th Saturday in the navy hoodie, the moment when Edward had said the navy one's not very heavy, and Marcus had understood, without saying anything, that the test had already been running and he was inside it. He thought about November, the last real Saturday, the way Edward had talked about Eleanor, the real version, the one he'd held back for 2 years. and the way the city light had changed in the late afternoon, and the office had gotten quiet. He thought about the letter. The trust is called the Eleanor Webb Trust because my late wife would have liked him enormously, and because his mother, Diane Webb, has cleaned the floors of my building for 3 years without my ever once thinking to ask her name. Consider this a correction. Consider this a correction. Marcus had never thought about what it meant for an old man to sit down and correct himself on paper, in his own hand, knowing it would only be read after he was gone. To choose, deliberately, without any possibility of receiving thanks or acknowledgement for it, to say, "I was wrong about this. Here is what the right thing looks like. Do it after me." He had spent 2 years being tested by Edward Hargrove. He understood, sitting on these steps in the cold, that the real test had not been about whether Marcus was honest or trustworthy or kind. The real test had been whether Edward was still capable of being wrong, whether there was still enough of him left after all the damage and all the loss and all the careful management of expectation to choose something different, to trust. Marcus had given him a chance to take it. That was what you did. That was the thing. You gave people a shape to walk toward, even when they couldn't see it yet, and you held the space while they found their way. He put the compass away. He looked at the March sky. He cried for a while, quietly, on the public steps of a courthouse. The way you cried when you were 14 and something large had happened and there was no private room available. People walked past. Nobody stopped. This was Chicago, and people who were not bothering anyone on courthouse steps were not anyone's problem. And this was one of the city's less comfortable generosities. When he was done, he wiped his face with his coat sleeve. He picked up his backpack. He stood up. His mother's car pulled up to the curb, and she got out and stood on the sidewalk and looked at his face and didn't say, "Are you okay? Are you all right? Did you cry?" None of those things. Just looked at him with the full weight of 20 years of being his mother, which contained multitudes. "Ready?" she said. "Yeah," Marcus said. She unlocked the car. He got in. The office was on the 3rd floor of a converted brick building in Pilsen, a neighborhood Marcus had chosen deliberately, close to the lake, served by 2 bus lines, in a part of the city where the architecture ranged from extraordinary to neglected, and the gap between those 2 states was the most interesting design problem Marcus could imagine. It was small, as offices went. 3 desks, one of which was his, one of which belonged to a structural engineer named Petra, who had the most effective glare Marcus had ever encountered, and one of which was theoretically available for visiting consultants, but currently held the overflow from Marcus's desk, which was a geometry textbook, 2 rolled architectural drawings, a travel mug of cold coffee, and a brass compass. Outside, May Chicago was doing what May Chicago sometimes managed. Warm and clear and honest, the lake visible from the 3rd floor window as a band of blue that looked, on days like this, like a promise about what the rest of the year could be. Marcus Webb was 20 years old. He had started at the Illinois Institute of Technology at 17, on a combination of academic scholarship and the Eleanor Webb Trust, declared his major in the 2nd week, and proceeded through the next 3 years with the focused intentionality of someone who had known what he wanted for longer than he'd had a word for it. He was, by the assessment of his professors, the most architecturally observant student they had taught in a decade, which they said not as flattery but as useful information, the kind IIT tended toward. He had also, in his 2nd year, found the project. It had been in Edward's papers. Forthright had forwarded them after the legal proceedings concluded, boxes of documents from the Hargrove Capital Archive that Edward had designated for Marcus's eventual review. Most of it was business history, interesting but not actionable. But in the 3rd box, Marcus had found a folder from 1994 with the words Southside Civic Center, abandoned, written on the tab in Edward's handwriting, and inside it the original design plans for a community center that had been proposed and funded, and then quietly defunded when political priorities shifted, leaving a foundation poured in concrete and nothing else. Edward had kept the folder for 30 years, Marcus had sat with the folder for 3 weeks. He had called forthright. He had researched the site. He had found that the foundation was still there, intact, on a corner in Bronzeville, covered in weeds and chain link and 26 years of other people's discarded things. He had started drawing. The project had taken 2 years to permit, 6 months to fund. The trust covered the seed money, a community development grant covered the rest, and was now 8 months into construction. It was not enormous by the metrics of the buildings Marcus would eventually build, but it had high ceilings and large windows and a reading room on the 2nd floor where the light came from 3 directions, and a community kitchen, and a wall of glass facing south that would, when the sun was right, fill the interior with the kind of light that made people want to stay. It was designed for the particular needs of the neighborhood, walkable, accessible, deliberately not institutional, deliberately the kind of building that said you're supposed to be here to everyone who walked through the door. On the corner of the design brief, in the space where most architects wrote their tagline or their firm name, Marcus had written, "Opens possibility, does not close it." He was at his desk when the phone rang. It was the site foreman with a question about the beam configuration on the 2nd floor that required Marcus to look at the drawings. He did, standing at the desk, one hand on the roll of paper, talking through the numbers with the easy precision of someone who had been looking at these drawings for long enough that they existed in his mind as a 3-dimensional space he could walk through. When he hung up, he stood for a moment, looking out the window at the May city. Petra, from her desk, said, "Beam problem." "Beam question," Marcus said. "Different thing." Said Petra, which was her most common response. Marcus picked up the compass from the desk. He turned it over once in his hand. The brass had the warmth of a thing handled often, the slight softening that comes not from age but from contact, from being held, set down, picked up again, the accumulated presence of hands. The lid had initials on it. E.J.H. Edward James Hargrove. He had never known the middle name until Forthright mentioned it. James. He had said it to himself a few times since, privately, in the way you privately complete a name that had been a fragment. He opened the lid. The needle swung once, twice. It still did that, a brief uncertainty before the settling, and then held. North. Always north. He set it back on the desk. There are things I still think about when I think about Edward Hargrove. I think about the way he stood at the corner of Maple and 5th, still, precise, as if he had placed himself there deliberately, as if the whole question was not whether he knew where he was, but whether anyone would care enough to stop. Someone stopped. A 12-year-old with a heavy backpack and somewhere better to be. I think about what he said in that letter. Consider this a correction. I think about what it means for a person to sit down, alone, knowing they won't be thanked for it, and choose to correct themselves anyway. Not for credit, not for witness. Just because they had been wrong and they knew it and they wanted the record to say so. I think the world is full of people who know they've been wrong and can't quite make it to the correction. The distance between knowing and saying is sometimes enormous. What Edward did, in that letter, in those 2 years, in the decision to let a 12-year-old walk him home, was cross that distance. Slowly and at significant personal cost, and not without stumbling, but he crossed it. The compass still points north. It always has. That's not the interesting part. The interesting part is what you do when you know which direction is home, and you're standing on the wrong corner, and you're deciding whether to ask. If this story found you today, wherever you are, whatever corner you're standing on, thank you for being here. If it meant something to you, you can like and subscribe and share it with someone who might need it. We'll have another story for you soon. Take care of each other out there.